Hello, people of grace. This Sunday we start our stewardship series called Christ, Commission, Community, and Cash. So today I just want to talk a little bit about Jesus Christ and this title, Jesus the Christ. It may seem simple to some of us, but I don't want to take for granted that we even have a clear understanding of what does Christ mean. Christ means the Anointed One. The Anointed One, to the Hebrew people, who was someone who God had touched with His Spirit to empower that person to accomplish some task that God had for him. And in that way, didn't even necessarily mean that the person was even a believer in God, or even if they were, that they were all that spiritually minded. For example, Cyrus, the king of Persia, is called God's anointed one. King Saul in the Old Testament was the first chosen king and anointed, but as he continued in his role, he really departed from any kind of walking in the Spirit, and eventually was removed and replaced, but he remained God's anointed for a while. And it was only when God withdrew that empowerment that Saul was unable to really effectively govern the people, which is what God had called him to do. So Christ just means anointed, but anointed carries this idea of that God's Spirit has touched you in a way to accomplish some task that God has given you to do. Well, that's what Christ or the anointed means, and we are Christians. We believe that ultimately the anointed one in all of history is this man we know as Jesus. But it does beg a question, why do we need an anointing? And the short answer I want us to think about for today is because our reasoning, our intellect, our resources are insufficient for the task. They're insufficient because we're human and we're limited. We aren't really designed to operate independently of God's Spirit. And number two, they're insufficient because we're fallen, we're broken, even rebellious toward God. And number three, we all carry with us wounds and traumas. And the anointing of God addresses all three of these areas. And ultimately, that picture of the anointing, sometimes symbolized with oil, and that's throughout both the Old and the New Testament, is a symbol of anointing and of bringing God's blessing into someone's life, is a picture of the third person of the Trinity, of God's Spirit, really empowering us to fulfill what God has asked us to do. So, what does Christ mean? It means anointed. As Christians, every follower of the way, every person walking in the way, has an anointing. John tells us this. And really, we need to trust that anointing to empower us to accomplish what God is asking us to do. So my short answer is, don't overthink it. When we're overthinking it, we tend to get a lot of anxiety. We tend to get frozen, paralysis by analysis, and we tend to really be chipping away through all of our supposed reasons at God's ability to empower us to do whatever He's asking us to do. But in the end, it is about taking that action, taking that step. Get moving. Trust the anointing as a follower of the way. Step into the arena. Take your best shot. Do it humbly, do it with counsel from others, but ultimately do it in faith, trusting in God's Spirit to allow you to do what He's called you to do. As Paul said, none of us within ourselves is actually equal to this task. But nevertheless, we are called to do what God has called us to do, and to land again with what the Apostle John said, His anointing is sufficient. It's real, it's not counterfeit, and it is enough. Find that grace-based inner confidence, step into the arena of life, and act and represent Jesus well as his anointed. Have a blessed evening.